Okay, here we go. Welcome in. We're just about to get started. Perfect timing. All right, so thank you all for coming and showing your interest here. Can everybody see my screen? All right, so this is the first session in the actual content of the manufacturing bootcamp. It's all based on the general product development process and how to set your specifications and product requirements. So my name is Matt Berlinich. I'm the Manufacturing Program Manager for InnovationWorks, and Jesse Mazzoni, who's also on the call right now, is our Alpha Lab Gear Program Manager, and Mike Formica is the Director of all of our hardware initiatives. So that makes up the IW hardware team. Afshan's not on here because we didn't have enough space. Sorry, Afshan. This is a partnership that we have with a similar organization to InnovationWorks based out of Rochester, New York, known as NextCore. So they developed the original curriculum, and we've been helping refine and revise it as well as implement it in this next sort of cohort. So very lean startup, iterative development process going on here. Love to hear your feedback, and we'll incorporate that. If you can, turn your cameras on. Not sure if you can change your names in Google Meet without changing your whole Google Suite name, but don't worry if you can't or you're not comfortable turning on your camera. It's important to say that this program is sponsored by the NIST MEP network. So NIST is a program of the federal government, and the Manufacturing Extension Partnership is a network of economic development organizations that are aimed at supporting manufacturers in the U.S. to help their businesses grow and be more resilient. Also sponsored by NISTAR, the New York State Department of Science, Technology, and Innovation. So between these two programs, the goal is essentially to help startups work with U.S. manufacturers more effectively so that everybody can be more successful. As I'd mentioned, NextCore developed the original content with support from Rochester Institute of Technology, FuseHub, InnovationWorks, and Catalyst Connection. So we're all sort of partnered on this curriculum. Twice. So this is the first week of the program. We're going to talk about product development and specifications. Next week, we'll talk about bill of materials and bill of process. This session will cover the technology readiness level, manufacturing readiness level, commercial or customer readiness level, prototype definitions, requirements versus specifications, market requirement documents, and product requirement documents. So the general product development process, the way that I like to think about it is initially you start with a concept, then you identify a technology which can solve that or implement that concept. You do that through prototyping to determine if you can turn it into a product, and then at the product level, it's all about scale and manufacturing. So first, at the conceptual level, really to get the most out of the curriculum, you should answer these questions and have solid answers to these questions before. The NSF I-Core program is a great model for doing customer discovery, which is aimed at allowing you to answer all of the questions of what is the problem, who's it a problem for, how are you going to solve it, are they willing to pay for you to solve it? And this sort of begins setting your customer requirements and thus identifying what your market requirements are in order to have a business. At this stage, you'll also be collecting user stories and essentially starting your business model canvas. At the technology readiness level, you need to start identifying components, and these terminology are important because they'll be used throughout this whole curriculum to sort of standardize the way that we talk about things. So components are individual components. That could be everything from a resistor to a bolt and a nut. The average car has about 30,000 parts in it, and those parts are components. When you assemble them into subsystems, they are a collection of components that do a very specific purpose. So In this case there, this is a toaster, and that subsystem is probably the power supply. Then whenever you assemble subsystems together into a system, it is a more complex mechanism, but it's still not the overall product. So that is a view of sort of the toaster lowering mechanism, which would be considered a system in the product itself. And then once you assemble all of those things into a product, it is your prototype or your product. So also important at the technology stage, you're trying to answer the question of, can you solve this problem? Can you solve it reliably and repeatably and cost effectively? In order to do that, you need to test, especially if you don't have endless resources, and nobody does. So there's different testing environments that are used in this TRL and MRL landscape. The laboratory setting is whenever you're essentially testing concepts, simulations, individual subsystems or components. It's a laboratory setting. The relevant environment is whenever you have sort of a hybrid of some controlled laboratory elements and some real world elements. It could even be you bringing in customers to interact with a fake product, where you're just asking them, okay, what would you do next? Or how would you anticipate interacting with that? So that you can start collecting features and requirements. The operational environment is whenever you are actually testing your product or your prototype in the field and under similar environmental conditions that you would be expecting it to experience during its lifetime. So, overview of the technology readiness level methodology. It was developed by NASA in the 70s to improve and assess the maturity of technologies that were being launched into orbits. The way that I sort of think about this is the technology readiness level has a heavy emphasis on extreme environments and one-offs or low volume things. Not many times that you're launching things into space repeatedly, aside from the space shuttle itself, but more like satellites. So you might recognize this for all of you who filled out the initial assessment. If you haven't, I recommend you go to learntomanufacture.org and answer some basic questions to give you a rough idea of where you are on the technology readiness level or the manufacturing readiness level. But you can see as you go across here, the technology readiness level and the manufacturing readiness level are the same up until level 7, at which point it becomes more differentiated depending on the scale of your production. And that's really what sets the TRL and the MRL apart. And we'll sort of go through the product stage, prototype stage, and testing stage throughout the rest of this curriculum. One thing that I do want to make sure we emphasize here is that what separates each technology readiness level is what's called a phase gate. And that phase gate is not an absolute law. It is really set by you. And so it is important for you to understand what your risk tolerance is, what your regulatory environment is, what your requirements are, because that's what's going to decide whether you can move on from one level to another in the manufacturing readiness level or your prototype testing stages. So, overview of it, some terms to emphasize. If you get, so TRL 3, does your technology actually work? Will it solve the problem? Technology TRL 4, do the pieces work together? Does the actual overall product or prototype work? 5, combined systems testing in a relevant environment. 6, prototype in a relevant environment. 7 goes to an operational environment, and then the final product being tested in the operational environment, whereas TRL 9 is everything is fully vetted and documented. So once you de-risk your technology, fundamentals of your technology, you'll be moving into the prototype stage to assess sort of, can you get to production? Can you make multiple of these and have them all function? There's a lot of different terminology out there for prototypes. It's not really standard, but some of the most generic one is works like, looks like, works like / looks like, and then final product. So works like can literally be an empty box. It can just be fake. It can be a simulation. It is meant to assess sort of your overall fundamentals of concept. It looks like, or shoot, I had that backwards. That was looks like. Works like is, does it actually physically work? Does it do what you say you want to do? When you can combine them into an actual prototype that can be tested with other users, that's your works like, looks like prototype. And then your final product, once your design is actually frozen, you're not going to make many changes to it. You can begin outsourcing the production of that to other places. So important to consider how many units you need in order to do your testing, because that's going to dictate what type of prototyping methods are accessible for the current stage that you're at. Low volume prototyping methods like 3D printing, laser cutting, hand soldered electronics, versus high volume production environments, which incorporate more automation, casting, stamping, injection molding, techniques like that. So at the TRL, MRL level 3, you would have what's called a pre-engineering prototype. And this is an example from my product, which is an ice mold system that allows you to cast perfectly clear ice cubes. So at this stage, I have all of these different foam housings and thicknesses. I have some commercial molds that I'd modified to test different hole diameters to see if it had the right convection currents that could be established in this system. These are things that are testing very specific variables, but could not be assembled into a product which I could sell or hand off to somebody else to test. Your engineering prototype is when you do assemble all of those things into what you hope will be your final product. And so that's where it's a works like system combined with your looks like system. And everything doesn't need to be finalized. You'll probably still be changing different aspects of the aesthetics and function. That's the whole point of that level of prototyping. Once you get to your EVT prototype or engineering validation testing, this is when you are starting to have a actual coherent product that looks and functions like you want it to, and you can sort of pass that off to customers to test. And you'll still probably be using a mixture of low volume and high volume techniques for prototyping at this stage, and that's okay. Once you get into the DVT prototype, this is your TRL level 6. You're probably using most of your final methods of manufacture and production for that level of the design, but you're not necessarily ordering high quantities yet. Once you get to the TRL level 7, that's where it begins to depart from prototyping, and the TRL and the MRL sort of depart from one another. But basically, if you get to this level of your prototype, your PVT, this is probably going to be essentially your final product that your customer will see. So you can see here, my EVT prototype doesn't look the same as my DVT and PVT prototype. It's a hard acrylic box with a foam insulation in it. It's still established the same sort of aesthetic constraints that I wanted to test. You know, sharp corners, rectangular, relatively shiny surface, sleek. So I tested all of those things, but I couldn't make these at high volume. This now DVT test, I was able to make pretty much everything with my production tooling, and my PVT test prototype was essentially the same one. It's just a first 10% order on that tooling, where if at that point I discovered any modifications to the tooling that needed to be made, it might affect simple little elements of its functioning, but it wouldn't make it an entirely different product at this point. So another term you've probably heard is alpha prototypes and beta prototypes. Really, those are terminology from software, and they are meant to actually be testing. So you would do alpha testing or alpha prototype testing using your engineering prototype. And that is basically, or your pre-engineering prototype. So I put some pictures of my early tests with this, where I was really just assessing very specific features to the insulation. How long did it take to freeze? How far in could it remain clear? How far from the top does it remain clear? different aspects like that. These are tests that I was running in my laboratory, aka kitchen, not something that a customer would provide feedback on. You have to have some level of knowledge and understanding of what you're doing at this point. Beta testing, though, is whenever you have your EVT or DVT prototype, it is your looks like, works like, all together, assembled. You should be able to hand this off to a customer, ideally with your sort of product documentation, and then assess if you're missing anything. If you're missing any features, if there's anything hard to use, if it breaks down, all of those types of elements. So you can see, again, this does not look like my final version. It's sort of a hybrid in there, blend. So just to recap this, that is where at this MRL, TRL levels 1 through 3, you're at the pre-alpha testing stage or pre-engineering prototypes. MRL 4, you have an engineering prototype. You're doing alpha testing. At MRL 5, you have an EVT prototype. MRL 5, 6, you have an EVT or DVT prototype. These are looks like, works like prototypes that have a combination of different levels of scale, producibility, and all of the different components. That's when you're redoing your beta testing. Once you get the results back from that beta testing, you might still make some changes to that prototype, or you might not. Move into production validation testing, and this is where TRL and MRL sort of depart from one another. And in the scale side, MRL is where you end up becoming more focused on what is your production rate. Do we need to switch methods of manufacture? Do we need to change the tooling, move from one cavity to multi-cavity? Can we do this on a single production line, or do we need to do multiple production lines? Do we need to find multiple suppliers? How do you vet and manage supply chain? All of those types of issues. That's dealt with in 7 through 10 of the MRL. So once you've vet all of that for the product, we move into the MRL. Already sort of went through this, but the key terminology here that emphasizes that are things like prototype, production relevant environment, product, production representative environment. Are you using a pilot line? Are you using low rate production? Or are you using full rate production? And those are going to be dependent on what methods of manufacture you select and what your ultimate scale needs are for your particular business and your particular industry. Everybody loves to think of jumping straight to injection molding, but injection molding is often not necessary for every product and every industry, just given the volumes are more constrained by the method of manufacture than they are the actual product. So back to the production environment testing. So we talked about laboratory versus production, or relevant versus representative earlier, but that was all within the context of your technology. Now, when you're at this MRL level 7 through 10, you are applying those same testing principles to your methods of manufacture. Is this a production relevant environment? Are you still producing it in-house? If so, have you set up a pilot line that would be comparable to what a contract manufacturer would utilize in theirs? Are you having one person make every component start to finish, or do you have it broken up into sub-assembly steps that would be handled by different people? Those are sort of hybrid environments where it's a production relevant environment, whereas production representative is when it's actually set up the way that it's going to be produced at scale, and you're sort of benchmarking what are your production rates and can you actually achieve those. Or if you're using a contract manufacturer, vetting them and asking them what their sort of takt time is. So another example for my product, a pilot line, in this case for a compression mold, might just be a single cavity tool. This is a double cavity tool, which means that every time it opens and shuts, it produces 2 parts. That might be one example for that one specific method of manufacture, what a pilot line could look like. But then as you move to different levels of scale, this is another tool of mine that has 6 cavities in it. So every time this tool opens and shuts, it produces 6 parts. So basically the cost of that part, the overhead cost of that part in terms of labor is then 1/6 what it is for a single cavity tool, and your production rate is 6 times as fast. We talked about this, 8 through 9, basically scaling your low rate production into full rate production. Once you hit MRL 10, it's full rate production. Another nuance and why I put this picture in here, this was the part that comes out of that 6 cavity tool on the previous slide. If you think about it, each one of those cavities is different than the other one. And if there's any hand operations that happen on each one, the part that is produced here, while being theoretically identical to that, might not be the same. So there are steps involved in going from a single cavity tool to a 6 cavity tool, which you need to make sure that you put into place for checking 6 different samples and then making sure that you can track which one came out of which cavity before you can qualify that tooling and move on from low rate production to full rate production. So it might seem like a very simple thing to move from MRL 7 to 10, but it can actually, depending on the complexity of your part, your product, there's a lot of potential for variation and error. So wrapping that up, how does this the overall product development philosophy sort of fall into this MRL TRL? In general, this MRL TRL 1 through 3, you're doing your pre-materials solution analysis. You're sort of like identifying what technologies solve the problem, what materials can you use, what methods of manufacture, and you begin finalizing those at MRL TRL 4. You begin assessing and checking the interaction between all of your components in the technology side. And then at MRL 7-8, you're beginning to assess how can we produce more than one of these that works. And then production and deployment is MRLs sort of 9 and 10. Just again to reiterate, phase gates. I know every time people fill out the initial assessment, you'll see that you are probably further along in a lot of ways than you think, but then you get an MRL level of 3 because you didn't do one specific thing. That's how that works. Is this whole system is designed to sort of uncover any potential unknown unknowns, things that you might be missing as you move forward into production that can become a much bigger issue later, or if you have to switch suppliers. But ultimately, you can move on without doing certain things if you set the phase gate appropriately. Another product development philosophy rating system is called the commercial or customer readiness level. And this is something that I think a lot of people in the early stage entrepreneurs get confused with, and they feel like they should be at a higher TRL or MRL level than they actually are. And it's because it's more linked to this idea of where is your business in terms of readiness. So if you've gone through the NSFI core program and you've done a whole lot of customer discovery and you have a really good idea, a really strong problem and how you're going to solve it, you can be at this level of CRL 6 or potential, but that could still leave you at an MRL 1 or 2. And that's where we lead. That's where it leads us into requirements and specifications, which I think is really the fundamental first step in beginning to produce your product. However, I will say that I am a hypocrite here because I still haven't completed one for my business that actually documents all of these things. I have many different scattered orphan documents that document all of the aspects of these product and customer requirements and specifications, but version control, organization, is it shareable, is it not shareable, when was the last time it was updated, all of that stuff becomes very much a nightmare. So before we get further into that, let's just outline a couple of key terms that will be used throughout this curriculum, and there's industry standard terms. So requirements are generally qualitative things. They are they're basically, I love this example that it gives. Our customer wants the product to be lightweight. That is an example of a product requirement, but that does not give you enough information to actually produce something, because lightweight is a relative term. It is up to you to then document and set a specification which quantifies what does lightweight mean in terms of this product. So the specification that ties to that particular customer requirement ultimately ends up being the product should weigh less than 100 grams. Now, the process of going from that requirement and specification is going to be an iterative process, because you should constantly be assessing, is this a valid requirement? Is that necessary? Each one of the specifications also should not be a specific number. It should be a tolerance range, because there's always going to be process variation. What happens if it is 101 grams? Is that acceptable? Is this a hard upper limit, or is this a relative term? What happens if it's 100.1 grams? Is that a problem? So it is not a fully well-defined specification, especially given different manufacturing methods or industry context. Now, another thing that I will say on this is that can be tricky, because there is product requirements and product specifications, but then there are subassembly requirements and specifications, and then there are component level specifications. And so it can become a rabbit hole that goes down deeper and deeper. And it's very good to start with this overall structure so that you can have a framework to begin digging in deeper and deeper and applying this sort of rigor to every component that goes into your product. So we always use, at least for the purpose of this curriculum, we talk about the MRD and the PRD simultaneously, because one document really feeds the other. Your market requirements document is everything that comes out of your customer discovery and your market research. These are, what are your target markets? Who is your buyer? What does their profile look like? How are you going to distribute it to them? What challenges are faced by your market? What's your competition look like? Things, all of these factors around sort of the business aspect of your product. How many of these am I going to have to produce, and on what time scale? These are all of the necessary inputs that are going to then set what your product requirements are. And they feed into your product requirements document, which contains more of the specification side of things. Ultimately, both of these documents, elements of them, are useful for not only your core team, but they will be useful for external stakeholders as well. So depending on how much of these resources you build out in-house, or outsource, it is a really good idea to build this framework out so that you can use it as a communication tool to make sure that your engineering team stays on the same page as your manufacturing team, which stays on the same page as your quality team, which also stays on the same, or needs to stay on the same page of your customer support team. And that's after the product is landed. So, as I mentioned earlier, you will have many specifications for each component and subassembly. You'll have firmware and software specifications, app specifications. All of these things are they can potentially live in multiple documents, but they will ultimately roll up into individual, they should roll up into one overall tracking document. And I'm going to, after I go through these lists of what is a must-have and what are some nice-to-haves, I'll walk through the two templates which are attached with this presentation and sort of highlight some of the key features and things that I think are critical for everybody to begin filling out if you don't have one already. And feel free to jump in and ask questions if something is unclear or you're not sure how or where things would go. But Must-haves, commonly and easily overlooked things, a cover page. There should be a cover page on this document which says what is the name of the product, what is the revision date and the last time this was touched, what was the version of this product, who wrote the document, who reviewed it and approved it, and then a unique numbering system so that whenever you have a folder full of these documents, you can very easily identify which is the most relevant one and which one ties to what product, especially when you have different SKUs. All of that type of stuff is essential. The revision history, I can't state how important that is. Every time you change that document, you should put a record in there of what was changed in that document so that the next time you or somebody else opens it up, they cannot be aware of the fact that it's not the same document they were looking at the previous time. It's good to put some of this stuff on every page of the document so that if it is printed out and left somewhere or used to transfer to a different member of your production team, they can make sure that what they're looking at is the latest version of it by going back to the master digital copy. It's good to group them into categories to facilitate review and also sharing with different types of teams. Putting a unique number on each specification is also helpful in cataloging different specs and testing methods for whether it's a component or a subsystem or the product as a whole. It should be shareable so that it can be viewed by all of the different team members. And, in the days before computers, this was simply just a filing cabinet that you would have access to that could have potentially all of these documents in an organized fashion. So you don't have to do everything digitally, but I would recommend it now. And then there should be a method of reviewing and approving each of these components in the document by the sort of relevant groups, whether it's your sort of quality team or your logistics and shipping side of things, or whether it's your prototyping and engineering. I will say, so I began my career in the nuclear industry, which is one of the most heavily regulated industries. And the way that we managed our documents for the nuclear power plant was with a system called EDMS, where anytime you had to make a change to a design document, you had to sign it with your own password. It checked it out and put a date stamp on it. While it was checked out, nobody else could view that. So everybody else knew that it was in process being worked on. You could then sign that document again in order to check it in. So there was a record of when it was checked in and out and who had it out that whole time. Same thing would happen with viewers, reviewers, and for verification. So it was a absolutely tightly controlled system, which is also a very expensive piece of software. So I'd recommend using the tools available to you to sort of emulate that system whenever possible to keep things under control. Now, I will also say that in the very early stages, when you're still finalizing all of your requirements and specifications, it's probably not necessary to be super strict about that because it just adds time to your development cycle. But that's where the framework of the MRL and the TRL can be useful in sort of identifying what stage you actually are at, and is your whole team on board with that by setting the right phase gates. Some other nice to haves included in here. I won't go through all of these, but this is just a list of a bunch of nice to haves. Instead, I think it'll be more valuable to go through the actual templates that we have shared with you guys, and that way you'll see what I think will be useful for you to actually attempt to fill out. I mentioned this earlier, a good specification should always have a tolerance on it. Tolerances are most oftentimes seen as a plus or minus. So in that example of 100 grams, that was an upper limit, so it should weigh less than 100 grams. But in terms of distance measurements, 100 millimeters plus or minus a half a millimeter is a common tolerance. Now, another common thing that I've seen in working with early stage companies is to over specify tolerances and put overly tight tolerances. If you put overly tight tolerances on everything, your product will cost an astronomical amount to make. And if you're an early stage company, it will make it far less likely that any manufacturer is going to want to work with you, because they will think that you'll be an overly demanding customer that also doesn't have the ability to pay for that level of specificity, or that you just don't have a clear understanding of what your actual critical functioning of your product is. So here's an example of a list of part numbers. We'll get more into this in the next session where we talk about your bill of materials, because this is essentially a subset of a bill of materials where each component has a part number, description, sizing, tolerance, surface finish, what the quantity is, stuff like that. This would be an example of a document that would roll up into your overall product requirements document for specific critical components of that product. Tolerance drawings are also a must-have if you're going to be manufacturing any mechanical or physical part. This is where those tolerances are oftentimes seen. This is an example of a stack tolerance where instead of giving the plus or minus, or in addition to giving the plus or minus, it just actually displays what the upper and lower limit is. There's many different ways to do it, and this is a science and an art all in its own. But I think the easiest way to think about this is that you can just dump this into or attach this to the appropriate part of your PRD. So what I would recommend doing for homework is to download the PRD template from either Bolt or Anna Thornton, who wrote the product realization textbook, which sort of accompanies this whole curriculum, and attempt to begin filling it out. I think this is a really useful exercise, and I'd encourage you to put some time on my calendar once you've done that. If you'd like a second set of eyes, I'm going to be scheduling another session later on where we can also bring a group of people together if you wanted to share your PRD or your specifications with people to see if there's anything that maybe you missed or should be included. But chapters 2, 3, and 5 cover these topics of product development, philosophy, as well as specifications and requirements. In the overall curriculum here, we had our overview presentation 2 weeks ago. This is the first presentation. There will be 7 more after this, and I'll be hosting open office hours for anybody, and we'll be doing some manufacturing tours as well later in the fall. So before I move on to walking through the templates, does anybody have any questions? And again, here is the link to my calendar if you want to put some time on my calendar to walk through any of these specific issues. Yes, that is the book, Mike. Which I do recommend. It is very thorough. It covers a lot of these topics and has useful checklists and things. Right. Didn't mean to stop presenting. I actually meant to switch the window. All right. Can everyone see my screen? See the Bolt template? There we go. Okay. So this is one of the 2 PRD templates that we have attached in the same folder with the presentation. This one was created by Bolt Venture Capital Group out of Boston. And the thing that I like about this one is that it has a lot of very simple prompts in it, and this is a less overwhelming view of creating a PRD if you've never done one or if you're just getting started. So asking questions like, what is the product, or why does the world need your product? What are you trying to solve? Who is your target user? If that is different than the purchaser, who is that purchaser? There are certain things in this template which I actually also like that are not covered in Anna Thornton's template. So Anna Thornton's template is expandable, but it's it, it doesn't have a fully fleshed out example, which might necessarily actually apply to every product. So certain aspects of it were connectors and user interfaces. These are good prompts and might be things that you would want to consider putting into the other one. If you're getting into like a full PRD, I would recommend using Anna Thornton's template. But these are some things that could be useful to add to that template and link in there. A block diagram of your data flows, a block diagram of your electrical hardware. Things like that are extremely useful whenever you're trying to communicate very quickly with either a supplier who you're trying to utilize to manufacture your product, or a technical expert or a consultant that you're trying to outsource something to. I mean, the reality is that you don't generally get anything for free. And so if it takes somebody that much more time to understand what you're talking about, then you're going to pay for that in the end. So it behooves you to, as you are defining those things, document it in a way that becomes organized and shareable and continues to be updated. So everything else in here is covered in a Thornton's template. So I did put in a record just today as I made some slight changes to this template. So this is an example of what I would recommend doing as you develop your template. So put a record in there of who made the changes, what date, and a summary of sort of all of the things that changed. One of the things that's nice about using a Google Sheet is, there's a full revision history that's kept of every change that's made. But I don't know if you've ever tried to dig into that. It can be daunting because it'll track every time you hit the keyboard in there, and try to assess, like, was this a meaningful change? Can take some unnecessary amount of time. But I will call out the fact that, so my product is this ice mold system that allows you to cast clear ice in a variety of shapes. And so that is the overall sort of product family, but there are different SKUs, which when you put a different mold in, that makes it a different SKU, but it's part of this sort of product family. And it can be tricky to develop how you want to actually name these different product families. And that's something that I definitely recommend thinking through, because from this perspective, this is discussing like the product brief, the voice of customer, things like that are going to be referring to the ice box as a whole. It's a system that casts clear ice of a variety of shapes. So I should fill this document out with that in mind, that, okay, what are the specifications? You need to use tap water, fill it up, put it in a regular home freezer, and it should produce clear ice. It should be able to be demolded by somebody of average strength and size. Things like that are the general requirements of what you're trying to achieve with that product. If you want to get into the specifics of very specific ones, like how does the cube tray function versus the sphere tray, if there is a significant technical difference between those, it might be worthwhile in creating a different PRD to track each one, and then making your name of the document easy to hold those together, but then just keep them separate. I will also say there's not a space in here for the version number of the product, but I would highly recommend including that in the product or project name. So if I develop a version 2 of the Icebox, I would want to make sure that there's Icebox version 1, Icebox version 2, what significantly changed about that design between these two specification documents to warrant a different version. It's different than this version. This is more the version of this specific document and what changed within the document itself. There's a space here to list the master list of all of the documents that you might link into it, but I'm sort of a fan of linking them exactly where you're talking to about them in the document. So moving from this cover page into the product brief. By the way, everything that's in red was an example that was filled out by Anna Thornton. So if you see red, that's something that's meant to be deleted and filled in for yours. Everything in black is more of an actual prompt for you. So I added these because I feel like this is a very useful thing to have right up front. If you're going to share this with a manufacturer and say, hey, I need you to make this, or can you make this product for me? Some of the first things that they're going to look for are, okay, what is this product? What does it look like? How big is it? How far along is this? Is it just a drawing? Is this just a concept, or is it an actual thing? So by having this in addition to your product brief and what it does, and ultimately just a short summary, having, do you have renderings of it? Do you have images of the actual product? Do you have an exploded view to give somebody a really instantaneous view of how many components there are and how they interact with one another? And then a link to your bill of materials if they are actually ready to really dig in and see exactly how many components they'd be dealing with. Just a general useful thing to have in that very first part. Another one I would say is it's good to have your brand statement and philosophy, because that's going to guide a lot of decisions about what you're trying to accomplish and who your customer is. But some other things to consider, which are oftentimes random little holdups. Where's the link to your logo, your brand colors, branding guidelines about sort of where does your logo go and how big can it be? What can it be used? Do you have two different logos for if it's on a dark and a light background? All of that kind of stuff. A general media package of, okay, if you're sending this to the press to just drum up some press, here's a link to your sort of mission statement and what your problem is that you're trying to solve with some sexy product photos. Another thing to consider on this product brief is sort of, what are your partners, your customer description, your distribution, your stakeholders. There's a lot that can be sort of added to and expanded on this depending on how nuanced your product is. This I would put into this sort of market requirements category of this document, everything in yellow here. So in the voice of customer side of things, these are things that you want to document about what is actually critical to your customer. What are they going to be the key purchasing differentiators, the things that are going to make somebody want to buy your product over somebody else's? How do those features relate to what those pain points are? Is this compatible with other systems in your ecosystem? Especially critical if you have multiple PRDs for different sort of versions or SKUs in a given product family. Then we get into the industrial design side of things. Renderings, color, material, fit, and finish is another huge one that oftentimes goes overlooked until the very end of the product. You can get started with it by just putting in a general statement of what you're hoping to achieve, even if you're nowhere near that. Or even if you don't have a complete works like prototype, you can still take a stab at actually just saying, this is what we're working towards. Now we get into some of the more specific, like technical specifications, and keep in mind that this is meant to be the top level of the product as a whole, and so that's going to refer to many different components. So you don't necessarily want to go crazy listing everything in this document, but it's good to have a sort of reference top level. How big is the product? How much does it weigh? What are its power requirements? Things like that, right at that top level, so that whenever any inbound requests come to me saying, can you introduce me to a manufacturer? My first sort of thing, sorry, okay, is this microscopic? Is this hand sized? Is this one person sized? Is this two person carrying size? Is this car size, which requires special material handling? Are we talking about making 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, or a million? Those types of things are really good to have in a super quick summary, because that's gonna rule out a lot of different potential vendors. And that's also going to be, all of these things are going to change continuously as you refine and develop the product. So keeping an eye on it in one place is another one, an important thing. Same thing with the selected components. So these are particularly critical components. If you have a custom component that you make in-house, if you have custom software or firmware that you want to manage and load onto your part every time, no matter what, you're never going to let anybody else see that. These are things that you can call out in this area here. I added this sort of column here to link to your bill of materials, so that this way it's sort of, you can have additional specifications that are relevant to a very specific part of your product, but then having a smart part numbering system that shows sort of what sub-assembly is that component part of, what assembly is that sub-assembly part of, and how does that relate to the overall product architecture is very useful. Now, getting into the cost and timing side of things, this is almost more of an internal project management aspect, where if you want to set a timeline for moving through these stages and what the volume is that you anticipate needing to produce in order to move from one stage to the next, this is a good way of having that high level to get alignment from your team, as well as alignment from any outside vendors or consultants that you might want to use. If you don't know these things yet, like what your tooling costs will be and what your COGS are landed or launching or at scale, you can at least put these things in terms of what your target is. And that can be useful to share with a manufacturer or somebody that you're looking to outsource this to, because they can then look through the tabs previous to this, they can see this part and they can say, sorry, you're dreaming, or no way in hell we're going to be able to hit that. And that can be a very useful bit of feedback. Packaging is something that always creeps in at the last moment and is surprisingly more complex than you'd think. Definitely something to begin considering from the outset, especially if you're shipping this product. That's where, sort of going back to the product specifications tab, how big is this in general, and how dense is it? Those are going to be things that maybe you can make some design decisions at that level that will dramatically impact your packaging and your shipping logistics, that can have cascading impacts all the way down the line. But also, how many of these things are you going to ship? Like, what is your master carton size? What is your retail product size versus your direct to consumer, like ship to product size? Is this something that's going to need freight? All of those types of things can go into this document. Then usage conditions. This is a really important thing that I think a lot of people neglect. However, it's most of the time when you begin talking to an electronics contract manufacturer, a lot of this will come up pretty quickly. So in the top level general side of this, where is this going to be used? How is this going to be used? By who? That can be a very simple way of determining and limiting if you've actually set all of your requirements. Shipping requirements, environmental storage requirements. So this is high temperature, high humidity environment, low temperature, low humidity environment. You can set the sort of values that you want to say are the thresholds of operation that you're expecting for this. And then this is in a gift box. So this is more like, are you going to be storing this in a climate controlled warehouse or a not climate controlled warehouse? Does your packaging hold up to those environments? Is this going to be delivered on somebody's doorstep in the rain? And does your packaging need to be designed for that? Amazon actually has a full set. If you want to use your own packaging instead of Amazon's, they have a full standard of design and testing specifications that you need to meet in order to be able to use your own box and not an Amazon box. But then there's the operational ones as well. And then non-operational for transport. And then material warranty and reliability side of things. What is the design lifetime of this product, both in terms of absolute time, but also cycles? And if it is multiple components to it, is it necessary to sort of break it out between each specific mechanism in that design? Moving on to the aesthetic side of things, this sort of goes hand in hand with the industrial design in your brand, sort of setting your overall quality mission. Like, what do you want your customer to be? What do you want them to feel whenever they get this product? Like an Apple product, clean, simple, robust, reliable, no imperfections at all. For them, oftentimes aesthetic defects are a critical defect, which is not allowed. So outlining that up front can help answer a lot of questions down the line as you go through a product development process, but also as you ultimately ship and then have to deal with replacement and warranty issues. The regulatory environment is a huge one. And this is going to be something that we cover in greater detail later down in the curriculum, as well as with some sort of techniques to identify what regulations and specifications should you attempt to meet. But generally speaking, the question is, what industry are you selling this into? Is it a regulated industry? And that sort of goes medical, nuclear, transportation, or no, defense and aerospace, transportation, public health and safety, food, and then consumer, everything below that. And that's sort of the Wild West. And then this is an extremely underdeveloped part of this template. But if you get to that stage, your service and customer support requirements and specifications. How do you intend to deal with manufacturing defects when they're discovered by a customer, different types of failure modes in use? Are you going to refurbish or refurbish products and then sell them refurb? Are you going to refurbish them and put them back into use as new? Are you going to have to service that product on site at your customer? Are you going to be potentially subject for product recalls? All of that type of stuff. These are sort of towards the tail end of the curriculum when we talk about other considerations for scale. But that walks through pretty much everything that I have for you today. I know that is an enormous amount of information, all condensed and thrown at you at once. It can be very overwhelming. And a lot of it, frankly, is overkill for a lot of businesses. But the dream of that is that it is hopefully comprehensive for just about anybody. And so my first step, whenever I fill this out from for my product is going to be deleting everything that doesn't apply to my product and then filling out what is actually essential for my performance. So, but what's up, Rohan?
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. That was very helpful. I've always aspired to use a lot of these, templates and everything to be, more structured, to communicate better the needs with my team. But a lot of times the challenges are around, as early stage, we don't have a lot of the information. The information is constantly changing. And usually it's just one person, often just me, making the documents and even looking at it, because everyone else just, doesn't have the bandwidth, or they're changing so much that there isn't enough faith in these documents. And like your example, like your product is launched and yet, you managed to survive without some of these documents. So do you have any tips on how to ramp that up? And because if I sit down and spend 2 days on this document, I know it's not going to be useful for the next 2-3 months. And then we lose faith in some of these processes. The same thing is with Trello or Jira or any project management system. We've tried doing that so many times and then failed. And then now it's just like an organic mess that, early stage startups have, of just getting things done without proper documentation of anything. So, how would you, maybe you can tell TRL, MRL levels at which we should have these documents, or some way of holding us accountable without feeling like
Yeah, that is a really, really great point and observation. I think that the best way is to set phase gate reviews for yourself and your teammates in your company. So if it is something that is going to be changing very rapidly and very frequently, then don't necessarily bother with trying to get it perfect, spending 2 days on something that's not going to be used. Just make sure that you put a meeting on the calendar to review this at that point when you anticipate getting to it. And also maybe setting a dual system there so that it's not purely time-based, but also triggered by a major type of event, like placing an order with an outside vendor or something like that, and having that checklist internally. That's another goal of this program too, is that having the ability to follow along with this. And I want to try to make sure that everybody sets those markers on their calendar to revisit things like that whenever the time comes. As far as the other part of your question, it sounded like alignment, and trying to get alignment from other members of the team and in using these systems. And I've faced a lot of those challenges, especially with my time at Tech Shop. There's no cure to that other than engagement. You have to get people to actually use the tool and be comfortable with using it if they're ever going to find value in it. But you also have to make sure that you are open to the answer that it might not actually be useful. And so what do you need to do to modify it so that it is useful? Or limiting visibility too, that maybe this whole document doesn't need to be visible to everybody in the organization, but breaking it out more. So Raj seems to have taken more of the business side of this. So it's giving him the ownership of that voice of customer and product description and branding side of it, where you're more technical and you have that technical piece of it. So then by doing so, they'll already be in the document, and it's just one click away from where you're also working and owning that part of it.
Okay. And also, do you have any build out examples of this, for someone who's already done this whole thing? I know there's some red text, but it would be nice to see what a mature company should be aspiring to.
I'm still working on an example for that. That is my dream. I think Adam had your hand up next.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Roha's question as well, because I've gone through a process of small scale manufacturing of a backpacking grill. And what I will say is I really wish I had a document like this, or even knew that I should have a document like this when I was dealing with the first manufacturer that I was trying to work with, because what ended up happening was I wasted several thousands of dollars and a decent chunk of time fixing a mistake or an issue that the manufacturer encountered that should have been specified more specifically by me. And so I think it's really intimidating to look at a document like this all at once and think I need to spend 2 days filling this entire thing out before I can manufacture. I don't think that's true at all. I think instead, considering a document like this to be a resource document that gets added to over time as you figure more stuff out, and that comes to a position of being complete enough for your manufacturer to deliver to you whatever it is that a close approximation of what you're trying to get. I think that's a more valuable way to think about actually going through and putting a document like this together, because you certainly won't know very much when you're first prototyping, but it's really important for a kind of like what you were saying, Matt, about version control. It's essential for a business to have a way to document what decisions it's made, and this seems like a good enough, as good of a resource as any other to do that, with the added benefit that you can then turn it over to a manufacturer and be like, here's what I want.
Yeah, that's a really, thank you for sharing, Adam. Oh, don't know why
Welcome.
that just I will say one other thing that to add to that story from Adam, super common misconception that we run into all the time at Alpha Lab Gear is people tend to assume that when they're relying on a contract manufacturer, an outsourced vendor, that they will have systems in place to ask these questions to make sure that they capture and document these specifications, that they have project management systems in place to make sure that they're staying on track with their production schedule, which they generated one time and gave you a quote and said, they're like, yeah, we'll do that. But it's never a good idea to rely on them without first having that communication and getting it written down. And so having, as Adam said, a sort of place to document all of those decisions that you've made as a business is really, really helpful. Kirby, you had a question?
Oh, no, I was just going to follow up on what Adam was saying, is that a way to determine what's important to put into these documents is what has failed. So if you get a bunch of parts and you can't assemble them because your tolerances are off, that becomes a requirement. So that's a great way to get buy-in from your team. It's just when something goes wrong, there's an update to your requirements to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So if you never have a problem in that area, it might not need to be a requirement, but predicting and reacting to past failures is a great way to inform these documents.
That is a great point. That's also something we talk about later on in this curriculum in developing your failure modes and effects analysis. And I think that one of the most useful tools and exercises that we talk about at that point is looking up a list of failure modes or failure verbs, and then just reading down that list and saying like, oh wait, that might apply. That might apply. I could see that going wrong. Yeah.
I can ask a question again if no one wants to go, but if someone does, please feel free. Just a point of clarification, when we talk about manufacturers who would receive a document of this level of specificity, are we talking about someone who's building the product for us, or like someone like a sheet metal vendor or like an injection molded part vendor who would just need the drawings and materials and tolerances?
That is going to depend. So what I've seen most commonly is in a product that has to do with and that has electronics in it. Generally, those electronics contract manufacturers are set up to do what they call box builds. So they would need a more comprehensive document to understand, okay, yes, we're going to make the boards, we're going to put the components on the boards, but where is this going to go? It's going to go into this enclosure. Okay, where does that enclosure come from? Am I inventorying and managing this, or are they? Complex systems like that are then where you're going to need a more robust system, and in working with a supplier like that, they will also expect to be able to see and review that stuff. If you are intentionally fracturing your supply chain so that you can manage multiple vendors for any given part, say you're using like a sheet metal component as your enclosure, and you want to maintain a redundant supply chain of multiple different people who can do that, you can then break that out at the BOM level. So that line item on your BOM has your specifications for that part, material, fit, finish, like geometric tolerances, weight, things like that. And then that can be linked into here as a critical component, or it's just managed separately on your BOM. So when you work with that supplier, you send them those documents and they don't need to see anything like this. And that can be useful also for compartmentalizing your intellectual property, so that nobody has a real full picture of what the actual problem you're trying to solve is. If they just know what they need to do, like in terms of bending this piece of metal or placing this chip on this board, but it has no software on it, things like that.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And I will say another comment too about domestic versus overseas manufacture. It's funny, this is a part of this defense. The Department of Defense developed the manufacturing readiness level as a way to improve quality and producibility of life critical parts. It's incredibly rigorous and well defined. And that is what you'll find in working with manufacturers in the US, is that there's an expectation that you have this level of documentation and specificity, so that, because there's also a level of accountability there. If they produce something that is faulty and it causes some harm to your end user, they want to make sure that you can't pass that responsibility on to them because they performed exactly as you told them to perform. If you are going to manufacture something overseas, there's far less liability and accountability there. And there's also oftentimes a lot less sophistication in terms of the specificity of requirements and things like that. It's very common for Chinese electronics manufacturers to just switch components without notifying you. It's if it has the same performance specifications, but it's not the same manufacturer part number, they might just, one version of your product will have this, and another batch of the product will have a different one. And they're making an assumption that it's not actually critical. And it's highly likely that that will never be documented or even shared with you. But they're very good at copying. If you give them a general set of requirements and say, make something that does this, they excel really, really well there. And it's much more rare that you'll find a manufacturer in the US who can perform in that way. So. Jesse.
I wanted to make just a couple comments and then also ask a question. Just from what I've experienced and also what we've run through here, talking about like requirements and specifications, I think it comes down to like a testability standpoint. Like if you're able to reduce maybe this process down to something that's everything that you need to test in order to verify that your product is actually what you wanted. And that kind of leads into my question, and you can, you know, whatever I said, you can correct it or not too, but I'm just wondering how this process and these templates, how would you suggest working them into sort of a test framework? And what, I guess, how does that, yeah, I guess I'll just stop it there. You work this into
Yeah,
a
no, that is a really, really good point. And that's something that we'll cover a little bit later in the curriculum. So I'll just bring my screen back up again. And I'd love to hear feedback on this too, as to what you guys think would actually be most helpful. I think that the product specifications that you're like PRD is that top level of the big picture. Is that flashing for everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, that's a nightmare. But I'll stop that for now. So that's the first thing that we cover, and then getting a little bit deeper into the bill of materials and the bill of process is what we'll talk about next week. So that's where you're sort of breaking that product out into each component. And then we get into cost modeling and risk management for getting into quality. And that's when quality is where we start talking about sort of, okay, how are you going to validate and verify that once the part is produced, it meets the specification that you set? And so by layering these documents one into the next, the bill of materials will be linked into this document, which is the overall hierarchy. And then that gets into each part. And the bill of materials and the bill of process are very similar, where it's parts and then steps. And you can have specifications, quality documents, and then quality control tests for each part of it. So with parts, you'd inspect a sample size of any given critical component, but then you'll also have standard operating procedures for any sort of assembly steps and a different method of quantifying whether or not that process was followed, where you'd have to perform that on a subset of the components produced as well. And this is again an instance where I love using highly regulated industries as the gold standard. So the medical industry is one of the more highly regulated industries, and the standard that they use is ISO 13485, which is literally a ISO standard that defines a quality management system which anybody who makes a medical device must follow, so that if anything goes wrong down the line, there is complete traceability from that product which was delivered to somebody and failed back to which batch of the manufacturer produced, or what manufacturer produced it at what time and in what batch. What were the quality tests that were done to ensure that it actually performed up to the specification that was set for that product. And all of that is linked all the way back through your device master record. And that's essentially what we're trying to emulate in building out and laying the foundation for these types of documents. But there's a reason why medical device manufacturing and nuclear is so expensive, because it does add time to put all of those documents down and in place and organize and manage them. And that's sort of going to be a part of your ultimate business decisions that you'd have to make, is how rigorous do we actually need to get? What is our potential cost of failure here to the end user, to us, to the general public? And then back to Rohan's point, this is something that I'm trying to work on to get all of this stuff together, is having a coherent example with all of those documents that shows how they can be linked. I'm really trying to get that in place because it is very, very difficult to visualize, especially if this is the first time you're sort of seeing this framework and trying to apply that to then your own product. I think the most useful thing would be to have an example that cascades all the way through, but still working on it. A couple minutes left, and then I'm going to have to run. Does anybody else have any questions? Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. All right. Well, if anything does come up, feel free to throw time on my calendar, bit.ly/IW manufacture. I'd be happy to talk with you and dig in on any specific sort of considerations for your product. I'd definitely recommend, if you haven't started, try to at least get started on filling out one of these templates. And that way it can be at least the starting point.
Matt,
Awesome.
where were those templates provided?
What was that?
Where were those templates provided to us?
I sent it out through Eventbrite, but I'm gonna follow up also via email.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll send a recording of it. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.